All right. So today, and Mike, this obviously is a good topic because it got you to show up. I wanted to talk about inspections and specifically cosmetic versus defect and working order, working condition, because this is something that if buyer and seller are not on the same page, it really gets, this is the issue they fight over. You know, the buyer wants this done, the seller thinks it has to be, and then says no, they don't want to. And some of it is also strategy. In fact, Mike, this came up in the recent forms committee at NABOR. We had a meeting last week, and this came up. And it was really interesting to hear some of the other attorneys and how they're dealing with inspection things. So really unique topic. Now, Mike, you just went through a closing with your daughter, and there were inspection issues, right? Weren't there a lot of things that needed to be done?
Yeah, obviously there's certain key points in the transaction. And once it's under contract, you breathe a little sigh of relief, but then the next thing you got to worry about is inspections. What's it going to come up with? And depending on what it comes up with, now how do I deal with that?
Yeah, exactly.
And
And
really, there's some strategy there, to be honest. And
there's a lot of strategy.
yeah,
And there's also some confusion. I think human nature is to try and simplify these topics, to try and do it the same way every time, keep it simple, keep it predictable. But we don't always have control over whether something is going to be simple. And so it's interesting, Dad, you always did articles in the past, and we continue to do them now, FARBAR versus NABOR. And one of the
Right.
things that you always pointed on was you really need to know both, right? You need to know
You
both.
you need to know both because depending on where you're buying, where you're selling, or if you want your offer accepted, you know the listing agent is going to be asked by the owner, "What do you think of this offer?" And they're going to downplay the offer if they're not familiar with the form.
Right, right, exactly. Well, I'll take that one step further, and it's like, all right, we need to know both. I get it. But
Hmm.
what is your go-to? And then how do you evaluate the other contracts in contrast to those? So I think everyone naturally has their favorite contract. And so let's understand that. Let's understand how it works. And then I'll try to compare it to the other one. So what we're going to look at, I'm going to say, in this case, NABOR is my favorite contract, right? That'll be the position I take. NABOR is my favorite. The standard contract is my favorite. And we're going to use that to evaluate the other options that are out there, just to kind of give everybody a way to look at it, a way to evaluate one versus the other. So let me share my screen here. So I've got our standard NABOR contract. You do have two contracts available. You have the as is and you have the standard. We're going to look at the standard. And basically, we're going to skip right to the part that is different. Inspections, section 2 here, inspection period. So buyer has so many days after the effective date to have the following inspected at buyer's expense as follows. Property and all appliances and equipment, including fire, sprinklers, irrigation, well, septic, heating. Basically, is the house working? Number 2, radon gas. Number 3, lead-based paint. Number 4, termites or wood-destroying organisms. And number 5, air, surface, dust. Number 6, existence of any open permits. So that's NABOR, right, Dad? Those are the 6 big things that a buyer is allowed to inspect for.
Yeah,
Regarding
mold and
inspection.
radon are the big distinguishing things with FARBAR because mold and radon aren't part of
Yeah,
this.
so there you go. It's exactly, Dad. So if we were to make that first comparison between NABOR and FARBAR, FARBAR doesn't have mold and radon. Now, I think FARBAR has a mold or radon addendum, right, Dad?
Yeah, it's if they find mold and it takes more than $500 to remediate it, then the buyer has a right to terminate. Which
Right.
I would never use that form because you could easily find $500 of mold remediation in almost any home in Collier County.
Yeah, mold is
Any
that
closet, pick a
four-letter
closet.
word that we struggle with because, and there are a couple of things when evaluating these defects that we struggle with in giving people advice and keeping the deal on the straight and narrow. And mold is one of those four-letter words that is really challenging because Dad, you always give the example of, family that's maybe coming in from out of town, and they have certain expectation of what's okay and what's not, and it may not match the contract. The contract may think, only certain mold is a problem. And that, in fact, is the issue with NABOR, is that they start listing defective inspection items. What is defective? So let's go through this. Any systems and equipments that are not in working condition. That sounds like a challenging, very vague term, wouldn't you say?
That's like the word reasonable. You have no real strict measurement of what that means.
Well, and they try to define it further.
Page 7.
Page 7 here. Systems and equipment shall be deemed to be in working condition if operating in the manner designed to operate. So you gave me the feedback. Actually, we're going to surprise Mike with this one. Mike, let's say you have a really old property and it's got sliding doors out to the patio, and it's, they're heavy. They're almost a little challenging, but they open and they closed. Is that a defect, or is that working in the manner it was designed to operate?
I would defer to my attorney.
Exactly. That's exactly what I expected you to say, Mike, because it's a tough one, right? Maybe it's old. Maybe it used to work better. It still opens and closes. It still locks. And I think if I'm the buyer, I can't expect it to be perfect. I think if the contract meant for it to be perfect, they would have said that. What they want to make sure, what is a door supposed to do? Does it open and close, and does it lock? If it doesn't open and close, if it's off the hinges, if the hinges are broken, if, like, I had a closing recently where it wouldn't lock, or actually I think what happened is it was off the hinge, they fixed it, and that caused the door not to be able to lock. So it's like you fixed one problem and you caused another. I think if you push even further and you say, well, you can't open it unless you're a 200-pound person, really strong. I don't know. That's really tough. And as a buyer, I just need to set expectations to say, look, buyer, we can ask, but if the seller says no, if they say it's working condition, we can't blow the deal up over that. It's not.
And look, and using the sliders, usually they want to replace the wheels beneath the slider, which costs X dollars. And we have that language in line 315 that no cost repair can exceed the fair market value of the item if it were in, quote, working condition again. So how much is the repair going to cost? If they're asking for brand new windows or brand new sliders, 315 is going to kick in.
Yeah, and so it's kind of this like balancing act when you're negotiating this stuff, and you say, all right, well, maybe the buyer has an argument, maybe it's not working so great, but it doesn't mean I'm obligated to put in a whole new slider. That could be $10,000. I'll throw you a $250 credit, and you can do what you want after closing, but it does open, it does close, it does lock.
Well, if your point of reference is a brand new slider, is it 5% more difficult to open, 10%, 15%, 20%? At what point is it not in working condition? And it's not clear.
Yeah, so this is the part that it gets really interested when we get into the part where we're start negotiating with the other side about it. But let's go a little further into what a defect is. So again, we've got our defect.
Christian,
yes, sir.
Can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Please.
I get probably the majority of my questions on the very first sentence in this inspection area, and that is the 15 days. The two questions,
I love this. This came up yesterday with one of my clients.
The two questions I get are, when does that first day of the 15 days start? And what about weekends? Those are the two questions.
Okay, that's easy enough. I'll throw another question in there, which was, why 15? Why 15? Why does the buyer want 15? That sounds like a long time. So let's hit each of those. We'll start with mine because it's the easy one. Buyers want 15 because the contract says that that's the default. If the contract said the default was 10 days, I have a feeling most of our deals would have 10 days on it. I think what I want to look at in that scenario is, how much time do you need to get an inspector out? We're not in the middle of COVID. Inspectors are available. It's the middle of summer. 15 days might be a little extreme. I did have a client yesterday who's flying in from Canada, and they've got to book their flight and they want to be there for the inspection. So they reasonably wanted 15, but we were able to get them down to I think it was 11. And they're like, okay, we can do 11. That'll work. But to your questions, Mike, the timing works the exact same way the rest of the contract would. Day one is day one of your contract. So day zero is when we sign the contract. That's when we get an executed contract. That's day zero. So day one is the next day.
Yes,
Day two,
it's
three,
after
four.
it's after the effective date.
Yeah, so the day
The
after
very
the effective
day.
date. So day zero is when you sign, or your effective date. Day one is the next day. So you simply count the 15 days. And this time period works exactly the way every other time frame except one. And so that is weekends count. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, you go all the way through the weekend, and only if it falls on a weekend does it move to the next business day. But you otherwise count weekends. It works the same way with financing contingency, works the same way with anything else.
When we get into the shorter time period, something shorter than 15, sometimes I'll talk to the buyers and say, if you try to presume when this thing is going to be signed, when the effective date is, if the seventh day, let's say you do 7 days instead of 15, falls on a Saturday, Sunday, then I'll tell the buyer you really have until Monday.
Yeah.
Unless Monday's a holiday.
Yeah, we even can get a little fancy with it, and we'll say, because that one other time frame that doesn't count like all the others is the condo review period. So condo review period does not count non-business days. So it doesn't count weekends, doesn't count holidays. So if you signed a contract on a Friday and you had a 3-day inspection period, it's going to count Saturday, it's going to count Sunday, it's going to count Monday. So Monday is your third day. But the condo review period doesn't count the weekends. So Monday is day one, 2 and 3 would be Wednesday. So Wednesday would be the last day to walk away due to the condo review period. So it's confusing, but you just have to draw the distinction between condo review period and everything else. And
I point realtors to standard R. That's where it is. Standard R subparagraph 5 on counting days.
now I got to find standard R. Here it is.
The miscellaneous, it'll come up in so many things, whether it's the financing contingency, the time periods for the inspections. If you write in time periods for other things, if the deadline falls on the weekend or a legal holiday, it rolls over to the next business day. So that's something everybody should know where that is.
And the nice thing is it works the same way in FAR. So that's a good thing. You don't have to learn 2 different ones. It works the exact same way. I think now I don't know this for a fact, but I do believe at one point FAR ended at 5 p.m. for every deadline.
That's
but
for
now
counter
I think
offers.
What was that?
That's for counter offers. FAR goes, they're precise with the statute they signed, the federal statute they're citing for federal holidays. So if you're on Patriots Day in Massachusetts, that might not be a federal holiday. It probably isn't because it's only in Massachusetts. So it can't be a local holiday. Now, NABOR doesn't make that distinction, but the FAR does.
Perfect. All right, let's look at more. That's a great question, Mike, and thank you for that feedback. So number one is any systems that are not working. So if the refrigerator doesn't work, if the roof is leaking, if things like that, then that is considered a defect. Number two, presence of radon gas at or below EPA levels, action levels. Number three, presence of lead-based paint. Number four, existence of wood-destroying organisms. Number five, presence of toxic or pathogenic molds. So we talked about FAR not having a mold as one of the defect or non-working general repair items. But NABOR says, all right, we do include mold, but only toxic or pathogenic molds, which means that if you just have the simple penicillin aspergillus, the non-toxic molds, it might still be a problem for your buyer, but the seller's not going to be obligated to do anything about it.
Well,
There's
the
definitely a
interesting
distinction.
thing too here, Christian, is that the original version of this in NABOR did not make that distinction. You know, it was all mold.
Yeah, what happened in those deals?
Well, we got whacked with 8,000 penicillium aspergillus cases.
Right.
So they cut that out. It's allergenic.
They said, wait a second, this is unmanageable. Every buyer is objecting to penicillin aspergillus, and they're, if the seller doesn't do anything about it, the buyer can walk away. So they're trying to tighten up the contract and give a buyer less opportunity to walk away. And they're, I don't, for this reason, for this as being one of them, it's why I like as is contracts, but we'll get to that later. So number 5 was that mold one. Number 6, void, expired, issued, or under review, or other building permits which have not been finalized, completed, issued a certificate of occupancy or completion, or otherwise resolved without necessity of further action, as documented by applicable government agencies. So if you have an open permit, expired, or any of those other designations, then that's also a defect. And now FARBAR does have that as well. They have the open permit thing as well.
Yeah, like they have the three categories they go under.
So we got a question, how many days is more typical if 15 is a bit excessive for inspection? It's a great question because it kind of depends. I'll give you 2 scenarios. One, you have a buyer who's in town, you can, you're trying to get the best deal you can. So you kind of made you're not offering full price. And so your price isn't the most attractive. Maybe your terms aren't all that amazing. You have a financing contingency. The one thing you can do is restrict your inspection period as much as possible. Take some risk away from the seller to say, look, I'm going to know within 5 days whether I'm in or out. So if you have a buyer who has those contingencies, those circumstances, then I would say a really short inspection period, because all you need to do is make sure that you do your inspection during that time. NABOR then gives you 5 days to make election. So even on a 5-day inspection period, NABOR is going to give you another 5 days to make the election. So you still have a good 10 days minimum where the buyer has time to put it all together, to make sense of it. Yeah. However, if you are offering exactly what the seller wants, and it's middle of summer and it's otherwise crickets, and your buyer is out of town and need to book plane tickets, and the inspector's hard to get on the books, 15 days might be perfect. Maybe that's exactly what you should ask for. Maybe you should start at 15 days and see if the seller objects. You can always come down from there, but let's give our buyer as much time as possible so we're not under the gun. But when we were really cooking, when COVID was in the middle of its frenzy and deals were flying off the shelf, you would see people waiving inspections entirely. And so you can see how it really depends what kind of negotiating power you have in that sense.
I also look at what time of the year it is. If it's the 4th of July week, Thanksgiving week, or in between Christmas and New Year's, you need more time.
Well, and I think that's a really good point. When I'm a seller, or if I represent a seller, I count weekends. I want to know how many weekends are you asking me to keep the property off the market? If we're, today's Wednesday, so if you're asking for 10 days, we've got Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And Saturday, we know, rolls forward to the next. So let's say a 10-day inspection period. So Saturday, we can't end on a Saturday, so we have to roll forward to the next business day. Let's say that's Monday. Technically, that's 12 days to do inspections and 2 weekends. I don't like that. I would try and negotiate for a 9-day inspection period, because then it ends on a Friday. I know by Friday, the buyer will have done all their inspections. But it's actually more complicated than that, because we still have that buyer election period. So
I know listing agents get in a lot of trouble with their owners if the owner gets surprised by the extra time. So they really need to look at when the deadline falls.
Yeah, doing the counting and educating your client is really tough. And one thing that I don't think I talk about enough is let's assume your client isn't getting it. They won't read the contract. They're not really, they don't have that skill, and they can't really understand what you're trying to tell them. I think that's a huge risk, that your client won't get it. And so you kind of have to limit that exposure as much as possible. You might even need to run to an as-is contract just to keep it simple. I do that a lot, where, hey, we're going to give you 9-day inspection period, but
not only when does the so you don't have financial leverage against the buyer until the second deposit is down.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So now we have, so you have these defective items. Let's talk about a little bit more defective versus cosmetic and where these issues pop up the most. Mike, I would love if you think of something specifically that you've seen recently where people are like, is this cosmetic? Is it defective? Can I ask for it? Can I not? I would love your feedback.
Cracked tiles is big. Old roofs, cracked tiles. People get
Well, let's talk
excited.
about that. Let's talk about an old roof, right? Is an old roof defective just because it's
No,
old? It's
no,
not. Is an old roof defective just because a buyer is going to struggle to get insurance on it? No. It's
no.
only defective if it leaks. Only defective if it leaks. It may also be defective if you have, like a shifted roof, like roof tiles, like if a whole row is shifted or has come loose, and you might have exposed underlayments.
Yeah.
If this is your tile and it's just cracked, but it's otherwise there and it's otherwise protecting the underlayment, I don't think that's defective. Not all the time.
I mean, there's four things, Christian, that I get a lot of that's considered cosmetic. One, corrosion, and it's cosmetic.
Corrosion / wood rot, maybe.
Missing screens, that's cosmetic. So
Yeah.
you have a screen enclosure and you have a missing screen for some bizarre reason, that's cosmetic. Cracked tiles comes up all the time, and limited roof life.
I would go a step further, Don, and say not just cracked tiles, cracked concrete. Like
Cracked
for instance,
concrete, for
the
sure.
garage,
Right.
the garage floor. That
All
kind
right, so let's look at this. This is how the contract specifies. Seller shall not be obligated to take remedial action. Let me see if I can zoom in a little. Doesn't seem like it.
I mean, these are things you want to warn your buyer about because they're a common sense idea of what's cosmetic is totally different, I think, from a missing screen or
Yeah.
Cracked tiles on a roof or minor cracked windows, for crying out loud.
So seller's not obligated to take remedial action or grant a credit in lieu of remedial action with regard to any cosmetic condition, which is defined as an aesthetic imperfection, which does not affect the working condition of the item, including corrosion, tears, worn spots, discoloration of floor covering, or wallpaper or window treatments, missing or torn screens, nail holes, scratches, dents, chips, caulking, pitted pool surfaces, minor cracks in windows, driveways, sidewalks, pool, spa, deck, and garage, tile, lanai, patio floors, and cracked roof tiles, curling or worn shingles, and limited roof life, so long as there's no evidence of structural damage or leakage. So if you have an old roof and a bunch of tiles are missing and the underlayment is exposed, I think that could be a problem. That is evidence of potentially a little bit more than just cosmetic. Someone asks, what is minor crack in a window versus a big crack? Yeah, it's a great question. We have
no
these
idea.
impact.
Honestly, you can
We have these
argue both.
impact windows now, and honestly, if you have a crack in an impact window, it's going to be expensive to replace, but it might still be operating correctly. It might still be sealed. It might, they're meant to crack so that they don't break. That's tough. I think that one's a tough one because I'll give you an example. We had a $2.6 million home that sold, and there were maybe 10 cracked roof tiles, and the buyer was pretty upset. Hey, this roof is a mess. It looks terrible. It's going to take forever to fix it. And I talked to the seller and I said, you might have a little bit of an argument to say that they're just cracked and the roof is otherwise fine, but we're selling a very expensive property. I think if you spent a couple $100 and got the roof tiles replaced, the buyer would be thrilled. And it was cheap insurance. Not always something you want to pay for, but something you probably should. Kim, I think it's a really good issue, and it's all about how you can sell it. If what you could do, if you said, and this kind of goes into other areas of inspections, but If you know about the window and the seller's like, look, I really don't want to do anything about it. It's so minor, it's so small. I had someone come out and they said it was fine. You could add it to your seller disclosure and simply disclose it in advance, and then it's not a defect at all. Buyer can't
The
make
buyer
that.
has to sign the form first too.
Buyers to sign the form, make it a part of the offer, and then it's no longer a defect. That would be one way to get around this. Alternatively, you use an as-is contract and you just tell them, hey, look, we're not going to be replacing the window. And then someone else asks, how does a large crack in deck around a pool apply? It's not a defect. Unless it's structurally compromised, it doesn't seem to be a defect.
And then the problem with tile with the pool surface, you can't do a core testing. There's no invasive testing allowed. And I had one like this where there was a crack in a pool, and it was cosmetic. And then later on, the owner found out that there are 7 cubic feet of missing soil underneath the pool because there were animals in there making it its den. It was actually my dad. So, and he was a builder.
So here's the interesting, they do a distinction of what is structurally sound. Working condition would be considered structurally sound, watertight, and free from wood rot. Seawalls, docks, and pool/lanai enclosure shall be in working condition if structurally sound. Doesn't have to be perfect. That's not
a minimal standard. It really is.
I think this form was created because this is a really hard thing to get right. Every deal is different. Every house is different. The parties, what's important, what's not.
Yeah.
Dad, you always made a mention of someone that, they thought that the railing on the stairway was a little too loose. And it's like, right. I don't know how to help you there. Like, is it a structural issue, or is it just not as tight as you want it?
Well, and part of it is too, we have people down here from all over the country, and they have different standards in different parts of the country, things that are considered serious in different parts of the country. And when we get somebody from up north buying down here, I kind of give them a heads up that, hey, this is semi-tropical down here. We're next to the Everglades. You will get mold. The question is whether it's a mold that you need to be worried about or not. Is there a moisture problem within your home? You had this, I believe, in Atlanta.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, here's the thing with Atlanta. The standard contract there is the as-is. So 99% of deals include an as-is contract. And the way we always saw it was, give the buyer an opportunity to do inspections, give the buyer an opportunity to renegotiate. If it's a really big deal and the seller won't do it, buyer's going to walk. But if it's a minor deal and the seller's like, look, I already gave you a good deal on the price, I'm not, or I have other offers, whatever it may be, then the buyer has a decision to make. Do I still want to move forward or not? Works the same way with as is here. It's just a lot of people aren't using them. And that's okay.
It's a big difference too if the buyer has $5,000 or $10,000 down versus say $60,000 or $100,000 down.
And it's a whole different game. It's huge. So let's compare this a little bit to FAR/BAR. NABOR, I think it's not a perfect contract, but I think it does a good job. And a lot of people in Naples are using it. So it was important that we start there. But let's look at how FAR/BAR differentiates from it. Number one, it requires that we put in some information here for seller paying amounts or percentages of the purchase price for the following costs and expenses. So it has 3 specified. Number 1 is general repair items. Number 2 is wood destroying organisms. And number 3 is open or expired building permits. Right. So you can see it has a different way of addressing a similar issue. So the general repair items we'll look at, but wood destroying organisms and open permits are almost exact matches to how NABOR would treat it or define it. But you'll notice, again, there's no mold or radon listed here. You would have to have a separate addendum for that thing.
And this is money the seller has to spend if
it falls. Yeah, that's the really interesting part. We're specifying seller shall pay. Shall pay is huge. That's a big deal.
And NABOR, the seller can just say, no, I'm not going to do it.
You could, absolutely. I'm trying to see if I can highlight like I did with the other one. I don't know if I can. Okay. All right, so
I think it's paragraph 12, they define General
Paragraph
repair.
12, you'll notice that you still have that 15 days after effective date to do their inspections. So distinction number one is that if the buyer finds a defect under these definitions, the seller shall be obligated to fix them. And number two, there's no buyer election period. So if you do 15 days, you got to get it all in 15 days. You got to negotiate what the seller's going to have to do or not, or give notice during that 15 days.
And that 12B also defines working condition and cosmetic for general repair items.
So we've got general property repair and inspection and repair. General inspection, these items specified or below, which seller is obligated to repair or replace, may be inspected. Buyers shall, within an inspection period, inform seller of any general repair items that are not in condition required by B2 below by delivering seller written notice. So it doesn't require an amendment. You just have to tell the seller what you found, and then the seller might be obligated to fixing them. You can see how it's quite different there. Property condition, the following items shall be free of leaks, water damage, or structural damage: ceiling, roof, exterior and interior walls, doors, windows, and foundation. Above items together with pool equipment. Let's see if I can scroll through it.
So you still got minor cracks in walls, floor tiles, windows.
Yep, they still talk about cosmetic conditions.
Cracked roof
Unless the
tiles.
cosmetic conditions resulted from a defect in an item seller is obligated to repair or replace. Working condition means operating in the manner in which the item was designed to operate. So they're borrowing that same language. Cosmetic conditions means aesthetic imperfections that do not affect working condition of the item, including but not limited to the following issues. The big ones come up are like those cracks, like you said, Mike, or the roof issues that we see all the times. I had an email yesterday from an agent who said, "Hey, can you help us determine which one is defective and which one is cosmetic?" It's a tough practice. It's hard to do it. Sometimes you just have to have perspective. You have to try and negotiate it instead of fighting over it.
Yeah, Christian, as far as the cracked roof tile, let's say it's cosmetic, so to speak. What about the scenario where the roof tile, you can't get it anymore? It's discontinued. Does that affect anything?
No, not because that happens a lot. You know, Mike, you mentioned that you had some trees fall in your house after a hurricane. And if, let's say, you were under contract, you couldn't have replaced all those mature trees. That just wasn't realistic. But I'm trying to remember what the language says about it, Dad, but it's something along the lines of, you know, you got a reasonable replacement or like a substantive replacement.
Well, again, you have no cost to repair or replace, say, the cracked tile. Let's assume that it was considered something that had to be addressed, which it's not. But even if it were, the cost to replace it cannot exceed the fair market value if it's in working condition. So if you have 3 cracked tiles and it was not considered cosmetic, it was considered something that had to be addressed, which again, it's not. Requiring somebody to put a whole new roof on the place is way more than the cost of those 3 or 4 cracked tiles.
Yeah, someone asked, what about cracks of an exterior wall of a house? So maybe cracks in the stucco. They specify minor cracks in walls are not a defect under FAR. I think again, it goes to that, what is minor and what is major? It really depends. And, would a major crack in a wall, does it cause some sort of structural issue in that the stucco is subject to water and deterioration and it's getting worse? And, again, if I'm the seller, I would want to disclose that in advance or use an as-is contract, or maybe both.
It's a catch-22 for the buyer because they can't do a core test, so they don't know if it's major.
Yeah.
It appears to be minor.
Now, I love this comment someone gave. In my experience, most buyers view mold as mold. Doesn't matter allergenic versus toxic. And remediation costs can be high no matter what kind of mold needs to be remediated. Isn't that a reason to stress a buyer using as-is contract or write in aspergillus/penicillium in the standard somewhere? I think you nailed it. I'll put myself on the line here. My wife and I, if we get penicillin aspergillus, if you did a mold report and it's off the charts, pinging left and right, we're going to be pretty uncomfortable because our motto is clean air, clean water. And we're a little more sensitive to it. than others might be. And so the seller, it's kind of a disaster waiting to happen, in my opinion. It's like that perfect storm where the seller's like, look, you're being ridiculous. And I lived in that house for 20 years without any problems. People are different. And if it matters to me, it matters to me. So personally, I've always used an as-is contract because my normal or my defect is different than others. And I just want it to be, look, I'm not arguing with you. I want this, otherwise I'm walking. If they call my bluff, maybe I'll walk away, maybe I won't.
I always use myself when I'm talking to my buyers and tell them, I grew up on the Cape. Mold is everywhere. It's our normal. We think it's quaint. But down here, it's a big deal. And depending upon the health issues in your family, if somebody is on radiation or chemo or has respiratory issues or is elderly, allergenic mold can be a big deal.
Yeah, can. Well, and so they got a couple other questions, which I love. What if a piece of roof tile is missing altogether, not just cracked? Would that be considered a defect? Yeah, I think that's a defect because the roof tile does have some purpose. It's not entirely just cosmetic. It protects the underlayment. So I know I replaced my roof recently and they put the underlayment on and the roof tiles were on back order for like 6 months. And they said, don't worry, the underlayment is warranted up to 12 months without any roof tiles over it. Of course, after 12 months, they'd have to replace the entire membrane. So if you had a missing roof tile, you know that warranty on that underlayment is going to expire and it's going to fail much faster than if it was protected from the UV rays and all that stuff. So yeah, I think missing is bad.
There's a inspection company in town owned by a contractor from Connecticut. And I had this conversation with him. I asked him specifically, what's the deal with cracked roof tiles? Aren't tiles in general decorative? Because we don't have those up in New England, honestly. I mean, we never had them in New England, except maybe Brookline, places like that. And his response is that for the most part, he thinks they're decorative, but they do extend the life of the underlayment. So it gives it a little more useful life.
Yeah, it's a 50-year roof potentially if the tiles are in good place and good order. It's a 1-year roof without it. So I think it means something. And Sigrid, you've got a great comment. I always try to point this out. When you are the seller, would you prefer that the buyer will use NABOR as is or a FR contract? Okay, this one's great. I love this comment. I think you got to know what sandbox you're playing in. So if you're in Naples, if you're in Collier County, I think you should expect to use a NABOR contract. If you're anywhere else, I think you should expect to use a FR. So Sigrid, if you and I are making an offer on a property in Lee County, we should expect to use a FR contract. We shouldn't fight that current. We should give the seller what they are expecting, what they've been trained on. Especially if we're going up Port Charlotte or even further. But if that same agent's coming into our neck of the woods, they should expect to use a NABOR. I don't want anyone to, have that be a reason that the deal doesn't go through. So I'll give you one other piece of advice. If you have an agent who just can't get it, just has to use FR contract or just has to use NABOR contract, and you're not that familiar with that form, use the as is. If you have a client, if you have a buyer or a seller who you're struggling to communicate with, that it's hard for them to understand the distinction between toxic mold and non-toxic mold. If they're struggling with that, or if you just don't have the time to go over it with them, use an as-is contract. Because if they want out because there's pathogenic mold or non-allergenic or allergenic or whatever it is, if they want out because of radon, if they want out because they don't like that all the screens are missing, they can get out. It just makes it simpler. Mike, you always say, I would refer to my attorney for that question, right? Well,
absolutely.
Alternatively, if you didn't have the attorney, if you wanted to, do it yourself and keep it simple, as is contract every day of the week. The Florida Bar had an article that they wrote several years ago as an opinion article, and they said the as-is contracts reduce the cost of litigation. They're just cheaper because you don't have to discuss what's a defect and what's not. You don't have to refer someone to an attorney to fight over defect. It's just, did you do it in time? or did you miss the deadline? It's fun, right? Awesome. This is like Pandora's box. I love that word today, but it is a very complex situation. Treat it with the care that it deserves. Defect, cosmetic, go to the contract, look at it, review it, and lean into us if you have questions about it, because we deal with it every single day of the week. And a lot of this is strategy, that is there an election period? Is there not? All that kind of matters. And I'll leave you with this. This is one of my favorite sayings, and I've said it a bunch of times this week, so people are probably sick of it. But my wife and I, when we were still dating, we went out and we saw, we went to like a club or something, and my wife said, you see those girls? You can't have a low slung blouse and a short skirt. You got to pick one. So that's the point. That's my advice.
You said that?
You can have the terms or you can have the price. Usually you don't get both. You got to kind of weigh the two. So if you have a really good price, then you can get better terms.
Yeah, I can't respond to that question.
I love that comment, because when you're negotiating and you're figuring out, is this cosmetic or is it defect? That's just like a tiny piece of the puzzle. You gotta look at the whole thing. If you're already being super aggressive elsewhere, then you have to be conservative here. If you're being a jerk over here, you better be nice over here, because ultimately we can't get everything. We can't be that belligerent. We have to be careful that we're not pushing our luck too much, because at some point a buyer or a seller will hit their breaking point, and it could be that straw that breaks the camel's back. It could be the fee that we're charging them, or this association special assessment, or you didn't tell me about the deposit needs to be due within 24 hours. Whatever that is, you have to realize, have you already been too aggressive to then ask for this as well? Or do you still have a little bit of brownie points? Dad, you and I always talk about brownie points. How many do you got stored up? And I think that matters.
I think that's marriage advice that I was giving you.
I just gave some good marriage advice. I love that one. Secret said, smart woman. All right, one more question, then we'll end. Regarding line 315 in the NABOR sales contract, let me put that back on the screen. So this is the one regarding market value of the repair based on the estimate provided. It says sliders cost, here's the example, sliders cost $500 new, but these are older sliders. An estimate to replace is $1,000. Which side is right? Again, I think it depends on how much you've already fought. So it's a great scenario. You've got these old sliders, they need to be replaced, they're broken, and they get the estimated $1,000. Well, they're old. These are not worth $1,000. I don't have to give you brand new sliders. And if you've already dinged me for 100 other things, and if I already gave you the great price, then I'm going to empower my seller to just offer the 500. If they're worth 500, we're going to give you the 500. If you want to replace them, so be it. If you don't, so be it. You can take the money and buy a couch if you want.
And again, if the buyer's deposit is $100,000 at this point, do you really think they're going to gamble $100,000 to save $500?
Yeah, you bring that up a lot. It's a good point. What are you risking by asking for it? What is the seller risking by denying that extra 500? If we're talking about that $2.6 million deal again, and we're fighting over, $1,000 to fix potentially cosmetic roof issues, but you got your price and the buyer's been a stand-up person and they haven't dinged you for a bunch of other things, give them the roof, give them the money, let them be happy, let them feel like they got something, because everyone has their line, that thing that they need to be happy. And if we can do that, let's do it. I love it. Great comment to end this out. If something like that were to come up for you guys, don't hesitate to reach out to us. This is basically what we're doing every day of the week, right, Dad?
Yeah.
I mean, this is every phone call for years. So you're not bothering us, you're not burdening us. Just ask. We'd be happy to help.
Happy to help.
All right. Thank you, Mike, for joining. I appreciate it.
Enjoyed it. Great topics.
Thanks, guys. Good luck this week.